Before we get into this story, I want to know where you're listening from right now. Drop your city or your country in the comments. At a school fundraiser, a wealthy parent looked me dead in the eye and said, "If you can't afford to contribute, maybe don't show up pretending you can." The room went quiet, but not out of sympathy. They all saw the same thing: the worn jacket, the old truck, the single black father who never had enough. What none of them knew was that every month I was sending nearly half my paycheck to someone they had never met. And when the truth finally came out, it shattered everything they believed about me. I had two jobs and one promise. During the day, I worked maintenance at a mid-sized office building on the east side of Columbus, fixing leaky faucets, replacing ceiling tiles, hauling broken furniture down to the dumpster. At night, I drove deliveries for a local logistics company, loading boxes into a van and crisscrossing the city until my back ached and my eyes burned. I was 34 years old. I had a daughter named Lily, who was 8, and I had a ghost that followed me everywhere. The memory of my wife, Rachel, who had passed away a few years earlier from an illness that had eaten through our savings long before it took her life. We lived in a one-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a building where the hallway always smelled like cleaning solution and someone else's cooking. Lily slept in the bedroom. I slept on the couch. The furniture was secondhand, the curtains were thin, and the refrigerator hummed too loud at night. But the apartment was clean, and there was always food on the table, and Lily never once heard me complain. She was a quiet girl, not shy quiet, the kind of child who noticed things other kids missed. She watched how I folded my shirts the same way every night, pressing down the creases with my palms because we didn't own an iron. She watched how I packed her lunch with the good bread and kept the heels for myself. She never said anything about it, but she kept a photo tucked inside her school bag of me and herself as a baby. And whenever a classmate asked about her mom, she would touch the edge of the photo through the fabric and say, "She's watching us from somewhere good." In our neighborhood, I was known mostly by what people assumed about me: the single dad who dressed plain, the guy who never came to block parties, the father who always declined when someone passed around a collection envelope at school events. People filled the silence around me with their own stories. I was on government assistance. I was barely getting by. I was one paycheck away from losing everything. What none of them knew, what I never told anyone, was where my money actually went. A short distance south in a small rental unit with a window air conditioner that only worked half the time lived Mrs. Gloria Santos. She was Rachel's mother. She was 71 years old, diabetic with a bad hip and a pension that barely covered her groceries. After Rachel died, Gloria had no one. Her husband had passed years before. She had no other children. Every month, without fail, I wired her enough to cover rent, utilities, medication, and a little extra so she wouldn't have to choose between the electric bill and her prescriptions. It was not a small amount. Some months, it was more than what I spent on myself and Lily combined. I never talked about it, not to my neighbors, not to the other parents at school, not even to Lily. It was simply what I did. The trouble began one evening at Riverside Elementary's annual fall fundraiser. The gymnasium had been decorated with paper leaves and string lights. Tables were lined with baked goods and silent auction items donated by local businesses. It was the kind of event where parents measured each other by the size of their contributions and everyone noticed who gave what. I stood near the back with a paper plate of cookies I hadn't touched. When the donation box came around, I placed a $20 bill inside. It was all I could spare. Mrs. Santos's rent was due soon, and the pharmacy had raised the price on one of her medications. Scott Whitaker, a real estate developer with a jaw built for confrontation and a watch that cost more than I earned in a month, was standing with a group of parents near the auction table. He had just written a check for $500 and made sure everyone within earshot knew it. When the donation box passed him, Scott glanced inside, then looked across the room at me. $20, he said, loud enough to carry. He shook his head and smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't really a smile. If you can't afford to contribute, maybe don't show up pretending you can. A few parents laughed. Most just looked away. No one said anything in my defense. I picked up my jacket from the back of a folding chair, dropped my untouched plate into the trash, and walked out through the side door. I didn't say a word. I didn't look back. Soon, the story had spread. It moved through the parent group chat like a virus, reshaped and inflated with every retelling. One mother wrote that I had barely dropped a few coins in the box. Another replied with a crying, laughing emoji and the words, "Maybe someone should start a GoFundMe for him." Scott himself didn't post anything. He didn't need to. The damage was already done. I couldn't even afford a decent donation. I was probably living off welfare. I had no business sending my kid to that school if I couldn't keep up. During recess, a boy from Lily's class walked up to her on the playground and said, "My mom says your dad is poor." Lily didn't cry. She didn't argue. She tightened her grip on her backpack straps and walked to the other side of the yard where she sat alone on a bench until the bell rang. That evening, after I had finished washing the dishes and Lily was supposed to be getting ready for bed, she appeared in the kitchen doorway in her pajamas. She stood there for a long moment, watching me dry my hands on a towel that had been washed so many times it was nearly transparent. "Dad," she said, "are we poor?" I hung the towel on the oven handle. I crouched down so I was level with her eyes. "We have a roof," I said. "We have food. We have each other." I put my hand on her shoulder. "We have everything that matters, baby girl." Lily studied my face the way she always did. Carefully, seriously, like she was reading something written in a language only she understood. Then she nodded once, turned around and went to bed. I stayed in the kitchen for a long time after that, staring at the wall, my hands flat on the counter. A couple of days later, Brian Hayes brought it up. Brian was the closest thing I had to a best friend, a fellow maintenance worker on the same shift, a big man with a loud laugh, who had been through his own divorce and understood what it meant to carry weight without talking about it. We were sitting in the break room during lunch. Brian had heard about the fundraiser. Everyone had. "You know, you could shut all of them up in about 30 seconds, Brian said, peeling the lid off a container of leftover rice. "Just tell them where your money goes. Tell them about Gloria." I shook my head. "It's nobody's business. It's your reputation, man. People are saying things about you, about Lily. You're just gonna let that ride? What I do for my family is between me and my family." Brian set down his fork. "Ryan, I respect you more than almost anyone I know, but pride has a cost, and sometimes it's not just you paying it." I looked at him. For a moment, something shifted behind my eyes, a crack, a flicker, but it closed just as fast. "Rachel asked me to take care of her mother," I said quietly. "She didn't ask me to tell the world about it. She asked me to do it. That's what I'm doing." Brian held my gaze for a long moment, then looked down at his food. He didn't agree, but he understood enough to stop pushing. Some promises weren't meant to be defended. They were just meant to be kept. That evening, alone on my couch after Lily had fallen asleep, I stared at the ceiling and replayed Rachel's last words in my mind. She had been in the hospital bed so thin I could feel every bone in her hand when I held it. The monitors had beeped in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. Her lips had been dry, her voice barely a whisper, but her grip on my fingers had been fierce, as if she was pouring the last of her strength into that single point of contact. "Promise me," she had whispered. "Don't let my mom be alone. Take care of her like she's yours." I had promised. I had said the words into the space between her heartbeat and the machine's hum, and I had meant every syllable. And every month since, through exhaustion, through humiliation, through every sideways look and whispered judgment, I had kept that promise without telling a soul. That was the kind of man I was, the kind who carried everything and explained nothing. The weeks that followed the fundraiser were worse than the night itself. What Scott Whitaker had started with a single remark, the community finished with enthusiasm. The rumors didn't fade. They deepened. I went from being the quiet father no one thought about to the struggling father everyone pitied. And pity, I learned, was a heavier thing to carry than scorn. It started small. A mother from the PTA left a bag of gently used children's clothes on the bench outside Lily's classroom with a note that read, "For families in need." She didn't write my name on it, but she didn't have to. Everyone knew who it was meant for. I saw it when I picked Lily up that afternoon. I walked past it without a word. Then came the suggestion. At the next PTA meeting, one I didn't attend, a parent proposed setting up a private collection to help my family get through the holidays. The proposal was discussed openly with nodding heads and sympathetic voices, as though I were a charity case who had already agreed to accept their kindness. No one asked me. No one thought they needed to. When I heard about it through a text from another parent, I typed a reply, deleted it, typed another, deleted that too, and finally put my phone face down on the kitchen counter. My jaw was tight, my hands were still, but something behind my ribs burned the way it always did when people decided who I was without asking. I never responded to the message. At school, the pity reached Lily too. One afternoon, her teacher, a well-meaning woman named Mrs. Caldwell, pulled her aside after class and held out a brand new winter coat still in its packaging. "I thought you might like this, sweetheart," Mrs. Caldwell said with a gentle smile. "It's getting cold outside, and I noticed your jacket is a little thin." Lily looked at the coat, then she looked at her teacher. "Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell," she said, her voice steady and polite. "But my dad already bought me a coat. I'm okay." She picked up her backpack and walked out of the classroom. Mrs. Caldwell stood there holding the coat, unsure whether to feel touched or embarrassed. That evening, Lily didn't mention the coat to me. She never mentioned any of it. She had learned something from watching me that dignity didn't require an audience and that some things were better carried in silence than dropped at someone else's feet. One day I got the phone call I had been dreading for years. Mrs. Gloria Santos had collapsed in her apartment. A neighbor found her on the kitchen floor and called an ambulance. By the time I reached her by phone, she was already in the hospital, dehydrated, her blood sugar dangerously high, an infection spreading through a wound on her foot that she had ignored for too long because she didn't want to burden anyone. The doctor stabilized her, but they said she would need to stay for a while. The medical bills started piling up before she even left the emergency room. I sat at my kitchen table that evening, staring at the numbers on my phone screen, the hospital's billing estimate, my checking account balance, and the savings account I had been building slowly month by month for Lily's future. I moved every dollar from savings into checking. All of it. Years of skipped meals, of driving the same truck with the same cracked windshield, of buying Lily's school supplies from the clearance bin, all of it funneled into a wire transfer to a hospital I couldn't even drive to in a single day. I didn't hesitate. There was no version of this where I let Gloria lie in a hospital bed without knowing her bills were covered. Rachel would never have forgiven me. I would never have forgiven myself. But the transfer didn't go unnoticed. At the office building where I worked my day shift, payroll and personal transactions sometimes crossed paths in careless ways. A coworker named Kyle, the kind of man who paid more attention to other people's business than his own, happened to glance at a notification on my phone one afternoon when I had left it on the break room table while I went to fix a pipe on the second floor. Kyle saw the transfer confirmation. A large sum sent to a woman named Gloria Santos. He didn't know who Gloria Santos was. He didn't ask. What he did was far more damaging. He guessed. By the end of that week, a new rumor had threaded its way through my workplace and somehow back into the parent community at Riverside Elementary. I was secretly sending money to another woman, a woman no one had ever seen, a woman whose name nobody recognized. The story wrote itself in the minds of people who had already decided what kind of man I was. I wasn't just poor. I was dishonest. I wasn't just struggling. I was hiding something, a girlfriend, a second family, some shameful secret that explained why I never had enough and never let anyone in. Brian heard the rumor one morning in the parking lot before our shift. Another coworker mentioned it casually, almost as gossip. You hear about Ryan sending money to some woman nobody knows, Santos or something? Wild, right? Brian didn't respond right away. He stood by his truck with his coffee in his hand and felt something shift in his chest. A doubt he hadn't expected. He knew about Gloria. I had told him, but the amount Kyle described was more than what Brian imagined. And the secrecy around it, the way I refused to explain myself to anyone, suddenly looked different through the lens of this new rumor. Brian didn't spread the story, he didn't confront me either, he just pulled back. The lunches in the break room became quieter, the jokes between shifts dried up. When I sat down across from him with my sandwich, Brian kept his eyes on his phone or found a reason to step outside. I noticed, of course I noticed everything. It was the curse of being a man who watched the world more than he spoke to it. But I didn't ask Brian what was wrong. I had spent years learning that some silences were chosen and some were inflicted, and it wasn't always worth knowing which was which. The one person who had stood beside me without being asked to was now standing a few feet further away. And that distance, small as it was, felt wider than any number of miles. The rumor reached Lily one day during lunch, the way most cruelties reach children through the blunt, unfiltered mouth of another child. During lunch, a boy named Jake Harlan leaned across the cafeteria table and said loud enough for the kids around them to hear, "My mom says your dad sends money to some secret lady. Does your dad have a new girlfriend? Is that why you're poor?" Several children laughed. A few looked uncomfortable. One girl quietly moved her tray to another table. Lily did not walk away this time. Something inside her, the quiet thing that had held steady through weeks of whispers and sideways looks and charity coats she hadn't asked for, cracked wide open. She shoved Jake hard in the chest with both hands. He stumbled backward off the bench and hit the floor. The cafeteria went silent. "Don't talk about my dad," Lily said, her voice shaking but loud. "You don't know anything about him." A teacher was there within seconds, pulling Lily away. Jake sat on the floor with wide eyes and a red face, more shocked than hurt. Lily was taken to the principal's office where she sat on a wooden chair outside the closed door, her backpack on her lap, her knuckles white around the straps. She didn't cry, but her eyes were red, and her jaw was clenched the same way mine always was when I was holding something back. I got the call at work. I told my supervisor I had a family emergency, clocked out, and drove to the school in the same old truck I drove everywhere, the one with the heater that only blew lukewarm air and the passenger seat that still smelled faintly of the vanilla air freshener Rachel used to clip to the vent. When I walked into the front office, I saw Lily sitting on that chair, small, stiff. Her feet didn't reach the floor. She looked up when she heard my footsteps, and for a second her face almost broke, but she pulled it back together the way she had seen me do 100 times. I didn't ask what happened, I didn't lecture her. I walked over, sat down in the chair beside her, and stayed there. The two of us sat side by side in the hallway outside the principal's office, silent, our shoulders almost touching. After a while, Lily leaned her head against my arm. That was all. On the drive home, I gripped the steering wheel and stared at the road ahead. Lily sat in the passenger seat, quiet again, her backpack between her feet. Neither of us spoke. But inside my chest, something was breaking apart. Not my resolve, something deeper. The belief that my silence was protecting the people I loved. For years, I had told myself that keeping my head down and my mouth shut was the strongest thing I could do. But now my daughter was sitting in a principal's office. Because of a fight she never should have had to fight. Defending a man against accusations that wouldn't exist if I had just opened my mouth. The question came back to me, the one Brian had planted, the one I had buried under duty and principle, and the memory of Rachel's voice. Was my silence still protecting anyone? Or was it just hurting the people closest to me? I didn't have an answer, and for the first time that scared me. The next parent-teacher meeting was held one evening after the holiday break. I almost didn't go, but Lily's teacher had requested a conference about her grades, and I never missed anything that involved my daughter's education. The meeting was held in the school library. About 30 parents sat in folding chairs arranged in rows. I took a seat near the back the same way I always did. Scott Whitaker was in the second row. The meeting began with the usual updates, test scores, upcoming events, a request for volunteers for the spring carnival. I listened with my hands folded in my lap, my face neutral. Then Scott raised his hand. The teacher running the meeting nodded to him. Scott stood up, straightened his jacket, and turned halfway toward the room, not quite facing me, but making sure everyone knew who he was about to address. I think there's something we need to talk about, Scott said, his voice carrying the careful rhythm of a man who had rehearsed this. There's been a lot of talk in this community about certain financial behaviors that raise questions, specifically large sums of money being transferred regularly to an unknown individual. He let the words settle. A few parents shifted in their seats. Now, I'm not naming anyone, Scott continued, though his eyes drifted deliberately toward the back of the room. But when a parent in our school community is involved in something that nobody can explain and refuses to explain it, I think we have a right to ask, especially when it affects the environment our children are in. The room turned. Every head rotated toward me. I sat still, my hands were on my knees, my face showed nothing. A mother near the front spoke up, her tone cautious but pointed. I think what Scott is saying is that transparency matters. If there's something going on, it would help everyone to just clear the air. Another parent nodded, then another. I looked across the rows of faces. People I had passed in the hallways for years. People whose children played with my daughter. People who had never once asked me how I was doing after Rachel died. And now they wanted transparency. Now they wanted answers. I looked toward the far side of the room, where Brian sat with his arms crossed and his eyes low. Brian didn't look up, he didn't speak. He sat there like a man who had already chosen his side. And it wasn't the one next to me. That silence from the one person who knew the truth, the one person who could have ended this with a single sentence, landed harder than anything Scott Whitaker had ever said. I stood up slowly, the room held its breath. I looked at Scott. I looked at the faces watching me. I felt the weight of every assumption, every whispered theory, every secondhand story that had been told about me in rooms I was never invited to. And for a long, terrible moment, I said nothing at all. Then I reached into the back pocket of my jeans and pulled out my wallet. It was old leather, cracked along the fold, held together more by habit than by stitching. I opened it and slid out a photograph, small, creased at the corners. The colors faded from years of being carried close to a man's body. I held it up so the room could see. It was a picture of three people. Me, younger, with a wider smile than anyone in that library had ever seen on my face. Rachel beside me, dark-haired, bright-eyed, her arm hooked through mine, and an older woman on her other side, smaller with deep lines around her mouth and a hand resting on the younger woman's shoulder. "This is my wife," I said. My voice was low, steady, and carried no anger. Her name was Rachel. She died a few years ago. The woman next to her is her mother, Gloria Santos. She's 71 years old. She lives alone in a rental apartment a short distance from here. She's diabetic. She has a bad hip. Her pension doesn't cover her rent, let alone her medication. I lowered the photograph, but didn't put it away. I held it at my side, the way a man holds something he's not willing to let go of. Before Rachel died, she held my hand and asked me to make her a promise. She said, "Don't let my mom be alone. Take care of her like she's yours." I looked at Scott Whitaker, who was still standing in the second row, his jaw set, but his eyes uncertain. "So that's what I've been doing," I continued. "Every month I pay her rent, I pay her electric, I pay for her prescriptions. When she collapsed and ended up in the hospital, I emptied my savings account to cover the bills. Every dollar I had set aside for my daughter's future, gone because that's what you do for family." I looked across the room slowly without flinching. "That's the money you've all been whispering about. That's the secret woman, a 71-year-old grandmother who has no one else in the world." The room was still. Someone in the third row stared at the floor. A mother near the window pressed her hand over her mouth. Scott Whitaker sat down without a word, lowering himself into his folding chair the way a man sits when the ground beneath him has shifted. No one spoke. Then a voice came from the side of the room, calm, measured, and carrying the quiet authority of someone who had been listening long enough. I wasn't going to say anything tonight. It was Principal Ms. Ellis. She had been sitting near the door, off to the side, not part of the formal meeting, but present, the way she often was at parent gatherings, observing, taking notes, staying out of the way. She stood up now, her reading glasses still in her hand, and addressed the room without looking at any particular person. What I'm about to share is confidential information related to a school fund, she said. I'm choosing to share it because I've sat here and watched a good man be treated in a way that I can no longer stay silent about. She turned toward me. For a couple of years, a donor has been anonymously paying the full tuition assistance gap for a student at this school, a child whose family couldn't cover the difference between what the scholarship offered and what the school charged. That donor asked to remain unnamed. I honored that request because it was the right thing to do. She folded her glasses and held them against her chest. I'm the only person who manages that fund, and the donor is Ryan Mitchell. If the room had been quiet before, it was now something beyond quiet. It was the kind of stillness that happens when a group of people realizes all at once that they have been standing on the wrong side of a story they thought they understood. I closed my eyes. I hadn't wanted this. I hadn't wanted any of it. Not the confrontation, not the confession, not the revelation from Principal Ms. Ellis. I had come to this meeting because my daughter's teacher had asked me to. I had stood up because they had given me no other choice. And now my life, the private, careful, invisible architecture of my sacrifices, was laid open under fluorescent lights in a school library. I put the photograph back in my wallet. I sat down. From the far side of the room, a chair creaked. Brian Hayes stood up. He didn't say anything. He walked across the library, past the rows of parents who were now looking everywhere except at each other, and stopped beside me. He placed his hand on my shoulder firmly, the way a man does when words would only get in the way, and stood there. I didn't look up, but I reached across with my own hand and rested it briefly over Brian's. Nothing else needed to be said. The meeting ended without formality. There was no closing announcement, no reminder about the spring carnival volunteers. People simply stood and began to leave, some quickly, some slowly, most avoiding eye contact with anyone else. Scott Whitaker was one of the last to stand. He straightened his jacket, the same gesture he had made when he'd risen to accuse me, and walked toward the back of the room. He stopped a few feet from me, who was still sitting with Brian beside him. Ryan, Scott said, his voice was lower than it had been all evening, stripped of its performance. I owe you an apology. He didn't elaborate. He didn't explain himself or qualify what he'd done. It wasn't a polished apology. It was short, stiff, and clearly uncomfortable. But it was real. I could see it in the way Scott couldn't quite hold eye contact, the way his hands hung at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. I nodded once. I didn't say it was okay. It wasn't okay, but I accepted it for what it was. A man standing in the wreckage of his own assumptions, trying to find the first word of a vocabulary he had never needed before. Scott turned and walked out. A few other parents approached me in the minutes that followed. Some apologized briefly. One woman, the same one who had suggested clearing the air earlier, touched my arm and said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know." I thanked her quietly and said nothing else. But not everyone came forward. I watched as several parents gathered their coats and bags and slipped out the side door without a glance in my direction. They didn't look angry. They didn't look ashamed. They looked like people who had decided that the story they had told themselves about me was no longer interesting and had simply moved on to the next one. No apology, no acknowledgement, just a quiet exit, as though the last few months of whispers and judgments had been someone else's problem all along. I watched them go, and I understood something I had probably known all along, that the truth doesn't change everyone. Some people need the truth to see clearly, others just need it to look away. and a few will never look at all, no matter what you show them. I could live with that. In the days that followed, word spread through the community the way it always did, fast, messy, and only half accurate. But this time, the tone was different. The whispers weren't cruel, they were uncomfortable. People who had laughed at the fundraiser now replayed the moment in their heads and wished they hadn't. Parents who had nodded along with Scott's accusations found themselves unable to meet my eyes at drop-off. A group of parents organized a small fund to help me replenish the savings I had emptied for Gloria's hospital bills. They presented the idea to me through Mrs. Caldwell, Lily's teacher, who relayed the message carefully, knowing how I would react. I declined. I appreciate it, I told Mrs. Caldwell when she caught me after school one afternoon, but I don't need it. If they want to help, tell them there are families at this school who could use it more than I can. Families who don't have anyone asking. Mrs. Caldwell nodded slowly. She looked like she wanted to say something else. Something about how sorry she was about the coat she had offered Lily earlier. But I had already turned toward the parking lot where Lily was waiting by the truck. The fund was redirected. It went to 3 families at Riverside Elementary who had been quietly struggling, families I had never met but understood in a way most people never would. Gloria's time in the hospital turned into nearly 8 weeks. The infection had cleared, but complications with her blood sugar kept her under observation far longer than anyone expected. The bills grew. I picked up extra delivery shifts on weekends and cut my own meals down to 1 a day to keep up. When she was finally discharged, she was thinner than before, and she walked with a cane now, but she was alive and she was home. I drove down to see her one Saturday, leaving Lily with Brian for the weekend. The first time Brian had offered to watch her and the first time I had accepted, neither of us mentioned why. We didn't need to. Gloria's apartment was small and warm and smelled like the candles she had always kept on the kitchen counter, the same vanilla ones Rachel used to buy her every Christmas. I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where Rachel had done her homework as a girl, and drank coffee that was too sweet because Gloria always added too much sugar. Even now, even after everything. Gloria reached across the table and took my hand. Her grip was weaker than it used to be, but it was steady. "Rachel would be proud of you," she said. I shook my head slightly. I just did what she asked. Gloria squeezed my hand tighter. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was clear. "You kept your word, son. Not everyone does. Not for this long. Not when it costs this much." I looked at the old woman across from me, the mother of the woman I had loved, the last living connection to a life that had been taken from me. And I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in years. Not relief, not pride, just the quiet certainty that I had done the right thing and that it had been worth every single thing it cost. One Sunday afternoon, Lily and I sat on a bench in the park near our apartment. It was cold, the kind of dry winter cold that turned our breath into small white clouds. But neither of us wanted to go inside. Lily had her backpack beside her. She carried it everywhere, even on weekends, the way some children carry a blanket or a stuffed animal. We sat in comfortable quiet, watching a man across the field throw a tennis ball for his dog. After a while, Lily unzipped her backpack and pulled something out. It was a photograph, worn soft at the edges, slightly bent from being pressed between textbooks and folders for months. She held it out to me without saying anything. I took it, and my breath caught. It was a different photograph from the one I carried, but it came from the same family. Rachel, Lily as a baby, and me taken in the hospital the day she was born. Rachel still in the bed, exhausted and radiant, holding our daughter, while I leaned in from the side, my hand on Rachel's shoulder, my face split open with a joy so raw it almost hurt to look at. I thought of the other photograph, the one still in my wallet, the one I had held up in that library for a room full of strangers. That photo had Rachel and Gloria side by side. This one had Rachel and Lily. 2 pictures, two pieces of the same woman's love, both worn soft from being held too often by people who refuse to let go. I have one too, Lily said simply. Mom gave it to me. I keep it in my bag every day. I stared at the photo in my daughter's hand. I looked at Rachel's face, frozen in that single perfect moment, and then at Lily beside me, 8 years old. With her mother's eyes and my stubborn jaw, my vision blurred. I blinked hard once and pressed my lips together. You never told me you had this, I said, my voice rough at the edges. You never told me a lot of things either, Lily said. There was no accusation in it, just the honest, unguarded observation of a child who saw more than anyone gave her credit for. I let out a long breath. I put my arm around her and she leaned into me the way she had in the hallway outside the principal's office, naturally without hesitation, as though this was the one place in the world where everything made sense. We sat like that for a while. The man across the field threw the ball again. The dog sprinted after it, ears flying. Lily, I said. Yeah. Don't ever judge someone by what they wear or what they drive or what they can put in a donation box. I looked down at her. And don't ever do the right thing because you want people to notice. Do it because it's right. That's enough. Lily nodded. She reached over and took my hand, her small fingers wrapping around my calloused palm, and held on. We were not rich. Nothing about our lives had changed in any way that could be measured by a bank account or a new truck or a bigger apartment. I still worked 2 jobs. I still slept on the couch. I still sent money to Gloria every month, and I probably always would. But I was seen now, not by everyone, and I had made peace with that. But by the people who mattered, by my daughter who had always seen me more clearly than anyone, by Brian who had found his way back, by a principal who had refused to let the truth stay buried, and by an old woman a short distance away who held my hand across a kitchen table and told me I had kept my word. That was enough. I was not a hero who stood on stages. I was the kind of man who stood in the quiet places in hospital rooms and school hallways and break rooms and park benches and did what needed to be done without waiting for anyone to watch. And that in the end was the greatest kind of strength there is. If this story moved you even just a little, I'd love to hear which part hit you the hardest. Leave it in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, come be part of this community. We tell stories here about the people the world overlooks, and we make sure they're heard. I'll see you in the next one. Looking back on everything that happened, the lesson that still catches in my throat and brings tears to my eyes is this. Never judge a person by the small chapter you see of their life, because the most powerful stories are often written in silence and sacrifice. For months, folks looked at my worn jacket, my 15-year-old truck, and my quiet ways and figured they knew me, a struggling single dad who couldn't keep up. What they didn't see was the promise I made to my wife Rachel on her last days, or how I quietly sent half my paycheck every month to care for her mother Gloria without ever asking for a thank you or a pat on the back. It broke my heart watching my little girl Lily defend me on the playground and sit alone because of rumors. But it taught me that real strength isn't loud or flashy. It's the man who sleeps on the couch so his daughter has the bedroom, who empties his savings without hesitation because family means everything, and who keeps his word even when it costs him sleep, meals, and his good name. Doing the right thing rarely comes with applause, but it's the only thing that truly matters in the end. My story showed me that dignity lives in the quiet places, and behind every tired face might be a heart carrying more love and responsibility than anyone could guess. So don't be quick to assume someone's story. Be quick to offer kindness instead. If this touched something deep inside you, tell me in the comments. Which part hit you the hardest? Was it the promise I kept, no matter the cost, or the moment Lily leaned her head on my arm? And if you're not already part of this family, hit that subscribe button and join us. We tell the stories of the people the world overlooks, and we make sure their voices are finally heard. I'll see you in the next one.